A house can be full of servants, candles, and clocks, and still be silent enough to break a child. At dawn, Thornfield Hall stood beneath a veil of pale mist, its long windows dim, its towers cut against a gray New England sky, its gardens silvered with frost that had not yet yielded to spring. In the eastern garden, where the late Duchess had once planted lavender and white roses, Lady Rose Ashbourne stood alone in her black wool coat, holding a porcelain doll against her chest. She was 7 years old, small and fair, with pale curls tucked beneath a bonnet tied too neatly by a maid who had not known what else to do with grief. Her lips moved as the morning light touched the frozen grass, but no sound came out. Not a whisper, not a breath shaped into a word. Only silence, careful and complete. From the tall window of his study, Duke Edward Ashbourne watched his daughter as he did every morning, with one hand resting on the cold glass and the other closed so tightly at his side that the knuckles had gone white. 3 years had passed since his wife's death, and in all that time Rose had not called him Papa. She had not asked for breakfast. She had not laughed at the spaniel in the stable yard, nor cried when nurses left, nor answered when governesses knelt before her with bright voices and anxious smiles. She lived among them like a little ghost who had learned that silence was safer than hope. Edward had summoned doctors from Boston, tutors from Philadelphia, even a specialist from New York who spoke gently of nerves, sorrow, and patience while accepting a fee large enough to feed a village for a year. None of them had brought back her voice. Worse, none of them had brought back his courage to sit beside her without seeing another face in hers. Rose had her mother's eyes. That was the cruelty, not merely the shape or color, but the same distant brightness, as if she were always listening for music from a room no one else could enter. Behind Edward, the study fire burned low, leaving more shadow than warmth. On his desk lay unopened invitations, estate reports, and yet another resignation letter from a governess who had lasted only 12 days. The woman had written that Lady Rose was unresponsive, that the household atmosphere was unsuitable, that his Grace's expectations were unreasonable. Edward had read only the first line before dropping the letter into the fire. He did not need strangers to tell him his house was unsuitable. Thornfield Hall had been unsuitable for the living since the day the music room was locked. The music room. Even from his study, Edward could feel its absence like a sealed wound at the center of the house. No piano had been touched there in 3 years. No sheet music lifted from the stand. No mourning hymn drifting down the corridor where his wife once sang while Rose toddled beside her, clapping small hands out of rhythm. He had ordered the key removed. He had ordered the door left closed. He had told himself he was protecting the child from memory, when the truth was far less noble. He was protecting himself. In the garden below, Rose lifted one gloved hand toward the rising sun. Her mouth moved again. Edward leaned closer to the glass despite knowing there would be nothing to hear. The doll's faded dress stirred in the cold breeze. A nurse waited several yards away, stiff with discomfort, already impatient for the child to return indoors. Rose turned toward the locked wing of the house. Though from the garden, she could not see the music room door. Still, she knew. Children often know the rooms adults try to bury. Edward closed his eyes. "Say something," he whispered, though no one in the study heard him, and no one in the garden could. Anything. When he opened his eyes, Rose had lowered her hand. The sun slipped over the frost, turning the lawn briefly gold, and the child remained silent. A knock sounded at the study door. Edward did not turn. "What is it?" Mrs. Helena Vale, the senior housekeeper, entered with her usual measured step, dressed in black silk and keys at her waist. "The new maid has arrived, Your Grace. Grace Miller. She is to assist in the nursery wing and the linen rooms, unless you have reconsidered." Edward looked down at his daughter one last time. Another servant. Another quiet footstep in a house drowning beneath quiet footsteps. "Does she have references?" "Modest ones," Mrs. Vale said, which in her language meant poor. "She is said to be obedient, capable, and accustomed to difficult households. Then Thornfield will not disappoint her." Mrs. Vale hesitated. "Shall I warn her about Lady Rose?" Edward's reflection stared back at him from the window, pale and severe, a widower wearing authority because grief had left him nothing else respectable to wear. Below, his daughter stood in the dawn with words trapped somewhere no title, fortune, or command had been able to reach. "Warn her not to pity my child," he said. Everyone who pities Rose eventually leaves. Grace Miller arrived at Thornfield Hall with a carpetbag in one hand and the kind of quiet courage that poverty teaches without ceremony. Rain had begun again before the carriage reached the iron gates. Not a dramatic storm, only a steady gray rainfall that softened the long drive, darkened the bare branches, and made the great house ahead appear less built than remembered by the earth. Thornfield rose from the mist in solemn layers of stone, glass, and shadow, its windows watching the road like tired eyes. Grace looked up at it without fear, though she understood at once why the driver had crossed himself before turning the horses away. Some houses seemed to welcome employment. Thornfield seemed to accept witnesses. Mrs. Helena Vale met her in the servants' entrance, dressed in black with keys at her waist and judgment already settled behind her eyes. She looked Grace over from the worn hem of her gray traveling dress to the clean but mended gloves folded in her hand. "You are smaller than expected, Mrs. Vale said. Grace lowered her chin politely. "Most rooms are larger than expected, ma'am. I have learned to manage." The housekeeper did not smile. "You will assist in the nursery wing, the linen rooms, and wherever the household requires hands that do not ask questions. You will not speak unless spoken to in the family corridors. You will not linger near the east wing. You will not enter the music room under any circumstance." Grace followed her through a narrow passage smelling of beeswax, damp wool, and old ashes. "Yes, ma'am. You will also remember that Lady Rose is not your concern beyond practical care. You may fold her garments, light her fire, carry her tray, and mend what is given to you. You will not attempt cures, games, prayers, stories, or sentimental nonsense. Better women than you have tried." The words were meant to put Grace in her place. They did, but not the place Mrs. Vale intended. Grace had stood in kitchens where grief was washed out of cups before dawn, in boarding houses where children learned not to cry because walls were thin, in sick rooms where silence gathered around beds with more mercy than chatter. She knew that better women often failed because they arrived certain they were better. "I understand," she said. Mrs. Vale stopped at the foot of the servants' staircase and turned. "Do you?" "Lady Rose does not speak. She has not spoken in years. His Grace does not tolerate pity." Grace's eyes lifted toward the floor above, where somewhere a child lived surrounded by rules designed by frightened adults. "Then I shall not pity her." For the first time, Mrs. Vale seemed almost uncertain. "And what shall you do?" "My work." The answer was simple enough to pass inspection. Mrs. Vale nodded and continued. They climbed to the nursery floor, where the air changed. Downstairs, Thornfield held the chill of noble mourning. Here, it held something smaller and sadder. Unused toys on polished shelves, picture books arranged too neatly, a rocking horse no one had touched in so long that dust softened its painted mane. At the end of the corridor stood a door with faded blue ribbon tied around the handle, not locked, but marked by habit. "Lady Rose's room," Mrs. Vale said. "You will not enter unless instructed." Grace looked once at the ribbon. It had been tied by an adult, but preserved by a child. "Yes, ma'am." Then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the corridor, came the sound of a floorboard creaking. Mrs. Vale stiffened. Grace turned her head. A small figure stood near the far corner where the nursery passage met the older east wing, half hidden by shadow, holding a porcelain doll in both arms. Lady Rose Ashbourne watched them without expression. Her pale curls were unbound beneath a dark ribbon. Her face was delicate, colorless, and too still for a child. Grace did not curtsy too deeply or brighten her voice or exclaim as others might have done. She only lowered herself enough that her eyes were not so far above the girls and said, "Good morning, Lady Rose." The child did not answer. Her gaze moved to Grace's carpetbag, then to the mended place on Grace's glove, then back to her face. Mrs. Vale stepped forward. "Lady Rose, you must return to the morning room." Rose did not move. Grace noticed what Mrs. Vale did not. The doll's dress was torn at one sleeve, a small rip no longer than 2 inches, carefully hidden beneath the child's thumb. Grace said nothing of it. Children often reveal wounds by covering them. From the staircase below came the distant sound of a door closing, then measured steps in the main hall. The Duke was somewhere beneath them, a presence felt before seen. Rose's eyes flicked toward the sound, and for one brief second, her lips parted. No word came, only the shape of wanting. Mrs. Vale sighed. "Come now." Rose turned away before the housekeeper reached her and walked silently toward the morning room, the doll held tighter than before. Grace watched her go, and the corridor seemed colder after the child disappeared. "You see," Mrs. Vale said, "there is nothing to be done." Grace looked at the empty corner, then at the forbidden passage leading toward the east wing and the locked music room beyond it. "Perhaps," she said softly, "nothing is exactly what she has been given too much of." Mrs. Vale frowned. "What was that?" Grace lowered her eyes. "Nothing, ma'am." But for the first time since entering Thornfield Hall, she knew her work would not begin in the linen rooms. It had already begun in the space where a silent child had almost spoken. The first day passed with the hush of a house that had trained itself not to hope. Grace learned the rhythm of Thornfield Hall by listening. The silver bell for breakfast that Lady Rose did not answer, the soft scrape of trays returning barely touched, the click of Mrs. Vale's keys, the distant closing of the Duke's study door, the relentless ticking of the long-case clock in the upper corridor. Every sound seemed careful, as if afraid of disturbing the grief that slept behind the walls. By late afternoon, Grace had folded linen in the nursery cupboard, mended 3 small stockings, and repaired a loose ribbon on a bonnet. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the porcelain doll with the torn sleeve. She saw Lady Rose again near twilight, standing before the locked music room at the end of the east passage. The child had come alone, silent as a shadow, her doll held against her chest, one small hand resting on the brass door handle that had not turned in 3 years. The passage was colder than the rest of the house. Heavy curtains blocked the tall windows. Dust lay pale along the carved moldings. At the far end, a covered portrait watched beneath a white sheet, its shape softened into something almost ghostly. Grace stopped several yards away, carrying a basket of folded towels, and did not speak. Rose did not turn. Her fingers remained on the door handle, not pulling, only touching, the way one might touch the hand of someone sleeping. After a minute, Grace lowered the basket to the floor and sat beside it on the runner carpet. The action made no sound, but Rose's head tilted slightly, aware of her. Grace took the smallest towel from the basket and began to smooth its edge. She did not say, "Come away." She did not ask, "What do you want?" She did not brighten her voice into false cheer. She simply sat in the same silence and let the child keep what little command she had over it. At last, Grace reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a needle, a spool of pale thread, and a scrap of blue ribbon she had found among the nursery linens. "Your doll has torn her sleeve," she said softly, not looking directly at Rose. "I can mend it, if she permits." Rose's grip tightened around the doll. The hallway seemed to wait. From somewhere below came the faint sound of men's voices, then the murmur of the house settling again. Grace kept her hands open in her lap. She may keep her secrets too. A mended sleeve does not require a confession. The child turned then. Slowly. Her eyes were not empty, as the governesses had claimed. They were crowded with things no one had taught her how to place outside herself. Grace met those eyes only briefly, then lowered her gaze to the ribbon, giving Rose the mercy of not being studied. Several breaths passed. Then Rose took one step forward. Then another. She knelt on the carpet just beyond Grace's reach and set the doll between them. Not in Grace's hands. Not yet. Between them. It was a treaty, small and solemn. Grace accepted it as such. "Thank you," she whispered. She lifted the doll with care and examined the tiny tear. The sleeve had been pulled loose where the seam met the shoulder. The fabric was old, finer than anything a child would be given now, and faintly scented with lavender despite the years. Grace understood at once. This had belonged to the Duchess's hands. Perhaps the dress had been sewn by her. Perhaps only chosen by her. Either was enough. She threaded the needle and began to stitch, slow and neat, while Rose watched every movement. The child's lips parted once, then closed. Grace pretended not to notice, though her own heart had tightened. "Some things look ruined when they are only waiting for a careful hand," Grace said. "A small seam can hold more than people think." Rose's eyes moved from the needle to Grace's face. For the first time, the child sat fully beside her, knees tucked beneath her dark skirt, shoulder nearly touching Grace's sleeve. The music room door remained closed above them. Yet something in the corridor had opened. At the far end of the passage, unseen by both, Duke Edward stood half concealed in shadow. He had come to reprimand whoever had lingered near the forbidden door. Instead, he found a maid sitting on the floor beside his silent daughter, mending a doll as if the world could wait for a child to decide how close comfort might come. He should have stepped forward. He should have ended it. Instead, he remained still because Rose had not pulled away. Grace tied the last thread and fastened the scrap of blue ribbon around the doll's sleeve. "There," she said. Not new, but held together. Rose reached for the doll and drew it back to her chest. Her mouth moved again, forming the beginning of something too fragile for air. Grace did not chase it. She only gathered her thread and sat a moment longer beside the locked door. Behind them, Edward watched his daughter rest one small hand on the maid's sleeve, light as a falling petal. No word came. Not yet. But in Thornfield Hall, where silence had ruled like winter, that touch sounded louder than speech. The next morning, Thornfield Hall noticed the change before any person dared to name it. Lady Rose ate 3 spoonfuls of porridge instead of 1. She allowed the nursery curtains to be opened before noon. When Mrs. Vale entered with her usual quiet authority, Rose did not retreat behind the armchair as she often did, but sat beside the low table with her porcelain doll in her lap, one finger resting on the blue ribbon Grace had sewn around its sleeve. These were not miracles large enough for doctors to record, but houses built on sorrow learn to hear small things. A spoon touching a bowl, a curtain ring sliding along its rod, a child remaining in the room. Grace said nothing of it. Praise, she knew, could frighten a wounded heart back into hiding. She only placed fresh kindling in the nursery grate and folded the child's shawl over the chair, moving gently through the room as if peace were a sleeping bird. Rose watched her, not constantly, not openly, but in brief glances that came and went like light through trees. Near midday, Grace found the child again near the east passage, standing several feet from the locked music room instead of directly before it. Progress, perhaps, or grief choosing a new distance. Grace carried a basket of mending and sat against the wall without invitation, as she had done the day before. The corridor was cold, the kind of cold that lingered even when fires burned elsewhere, as if the locked room had kept winter for itself. Rose lowered herself onto the carpet across from Grace, the doll tucked beneath her arm. For several minutes, neither of them moved except for Grace's needle passing in and out of a torn handkerchief. Then, from under the music room door, the wind slipped through a narrow gap and made a faint trembling note. Not music exactly, only air finding wood. Rose's head lifted. Grace heard it too. A thin, uneven sound, almost like the first line of a lullaby before memory decides whether to continue. She did not know the song, yet something in the child's face told her that Rose did. Grace set down her sewing. Very softly, without words at first, she hummed the note back. Rose became still. The hallway seemed to draw all its shadows closer. Grace let the sound fade, then followed it with another, careful and low, shaping a melody out of the draft beneath the door. She did not sing loudly enough to summon anyone. She sang as one might light a candle in a room where someone was sleeping. Rose's lips parted. Her eyes grew wide, not with fear, but with recognition so painful it looked almost like fear. At the far end of the passage, Duke Edward had stopped mid-step. He had come down from his study after hearing from Mrs. Vale that the new maid had again lingered near the east wing. Irritation had brought him there. Then the humming reached him, and irritation left him as suddenly as breath leaves a struck bell. He knew that melody. His wife had sung it on winter mornings when Rose was an infant, and the world inside Thornfield still had warmth enough to waste. Edward's hand closed around the head of his cane. The corridor before him blurred, not from tears he would permit, but from memory refusing to remain buried. Grace, unaware of him, added words so quietly they seemed meant only for the floorboards and the child beside her. They were simple words, old and tender, about morning light finding the window and little birds waking beneath the eaves. Rose did not sing. She did not speak, but she leaned toward the sound as if some locked place inside her had heard a key turn. When Grace finished, silence returned, larger than before, but no longer empty. Rose looked at the music room door, then at Grace, then down at the doll. With careful fingers, she lifted the doll's repaired sleeve and touched the blue ribbon. Her lips moved once. A breath came out, faint, unshaped, but real. Grace's heart leapt, but her face remained calm. She picked up her sewing again, though her hands wanted to tremble. "Yes," she whispered, as if the sound had been a complete sentence. "I heard." Edward took one step back into shadow before either of them could see him. His daughter had made a sound, not a word, not enough for anyone else to call proof. But he had heard it, and for the first time in 3 years, hope did not feel like comfort. It felt like terror, because if Rose could return to him, then he might have to forgive himself for all the mornings he had watched her from a window instead of kneeling beside her in the garden. That evening, Grace was summoned to the Duke's study. The message came through Mrs. Vale, delivered with a face so carefully composed that Grace could not tell whether she had been praised, dismissed, or condemned before she even reached the door. She wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed the plain gray fabric of her dress, and followed the housekeeper down the main corridor where portraits of Ashbourne ancestors watched from gilt frames with the cold patience of people who had never needed wages. The study doors stood partly open. Firelight moved over shelves of leather-bound books, estate maps, and the dark mahogany desk where Duke Edward sat with a resignation letter folded beneath one hand. He rose when Grace entered, a courtesy that startled her more than anger would have. "Miss Miller," he said. "Your Grace." Mrs. Vale withdrew, closing the door with a quiet click that seemed louder than it was. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped against the windows. The long-case clock in the hall counted seconds with stern precision. Grace kept her eyes lowered, not from fear, but from training. In grand houses, servants survive by knowing which silences belong to them. Edward looked at the young woman before him and found her nothing like the people who usually claimed they could help his daughter. She wore no confidence like perfume. She carried no theories, no polished phrases from doctors, no eager hunger to be recognized for compassion. Her hands were marked by work. Her posture was respectful without being small. That unsettled him. "You were in the East Passage today," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "You were told not to linger there." "Yes, Your Grace." "And yet you did." Grace lifted her eyes then. They were calm, gray-blue, and far more direct than he expected from a maid standing before a duke. Lady Rose was there first. The answer struck him because it made obedience sound less important than attention. He moved behind the desk, not to distance himself from her, but because the nearness of truth had become difficult. "My daughter is not a project for your sympathy." "No, Your Grace." "Nor a puzzle to solve." "No, then what do you think you are doing?" Grace considered lying in the useful way servants sometimes lied, with humility stretched thin over resentment. Instead, she told the truth. "I am sitting where she sits, so she does not have to sit alone." The clock continued. The fire shifted. Edward looked away first. "You hummed a song." The wind gave the first note. "Do not be poetic with me. I meant it plainly." His hand tightened on the back of his chair. "That song belonged to my wife." Grace's face softened, but not with pity. He watched for pity the way a wounded animal watches for a raised hand. It did not come. "Then perhaps Lady Rose remembered it before I did," she said. "I did not know." "No, you could not have." His voice dropped. "That is what makes it dangerous." Grace stood very still. Music? Hope. The word left him like something pulled from a locked drawer. He turned toward the windows, where the rain made the glass black enough to reflect him back. Widower, father, duke, coward in fine clothes. Every governess arrived certain she could restore what grief had taken. Every nurse promised patience until patience became inconvenience. Each departure taught Rose that reaching even an inch toward the world only meant watching someone walk away from her. He faced Grace again. "If you awaken hope in my child and then leave, you will do harm no doctor can name." Grace received the warning in silence. She thought of her own childhood, of boarding rooms and temporary kindness, of women who stroked her hair on Sunday and forgot her by Monday, of learning that hunger hurt less than expecting bread. When she spoke, her voice was low. "Children do not fear hope first, Your Grace. Adults teach them to fear it by offering it carelessly." Edward flinched, almost invisibly. "And you offer it carefully?" "I offer what I can keep. A mended sleeve. A chair in the corridor. A song if she wants it. Silence if she does not. That is not enough. It may be more than she has had." The words were not sharp, but they found their mark. Edward looked toward the covered portrait above the mantel, the one he had not uncovered since the day after the funeral. His wife's outline waited beneath white cloth, present and withheld, like nearly everything in Thornfield. You presume much for someone newly arrived. Yes, Grace said, but not about you. About sorrow. He turned back to her. Something in the room had altered. She was still a maid. He was still a duke. The distance between them remained written into the carpet, the desk, the wages paid from his account. Yet grief had stepped between rank and made both of them human for one dangerous moment. Before Edward could answer, a small sound came from the corridor. Not a knock, not a word. A soft scrape against the door. Grace turned first. Edward crossed the room and opened it. Lady Rose stood outside in her nightdress and robe, porcelain doll in her arms, blue ribbon bright against the faded sleeve. Her eyes moved from her father to Grace, then down to the floor. Mrs. Vale appeared at the end of the hall, alarmed, but Edward lifted one hand to stop her. Rose raised the doll slightly toward Grace. Her lips moved. A breath trembled. No word formed. Grace knelt, slow enough not to startle her. Does she need another stitch? Rose looked at the doll, then at the Duke. For a moment, father and child stood only feet apart, separated by 3 years of unsaid things. Edward lowered himself to one knee as well, awkwardly, as if humility were a language he had forgotten. May I see? He asked. Rose did not give him the doll, but she did not step back. Grace saw Edward's face change, saw the pain and wonder of a man receiving less than he longed for, and understanding it was still a gift. In the hallway outside the study, Thornfield held its breath again. This time, it did not feel empty. It felt as if a door somewhere inside the house had opened by the width of a child's hand. The next morning, Lady Rose waited outside the linen room before Grace arrived. It was not a grand change, not the sort of moment anyone in society would have understood, but within Thornfield Hall it felt almost impossible. Rose stood with her porcelain doll tucked beneath one arm and the blue ribbon held loose in her other hand, as if the night had persuaded her to trust the mending, but not yet the knot. Grace stopped at the end of the corridor and did not hurry toward her. Some timid creatures flee from sudden joy as quickly as from anger. "Good morning, Lady Rose," she said softly. Rose looked at her, then lifted the ribbon. Grace understood. It has come undone. The child nodded once. Only once. But Grace felt the gesture pass through the house, like a small bell. She knelt and tied the ribbon again, her fingers slow and careful, while Rose watched every loop and fold. At the far end of the hallway, unseen by the child, Duke Edward had paused on the staircase with one hand resting on the rail. He had meant to pass quietly to his study. Instead, he found himself listening to the absence of fear. When Grace finished, she did not hand the doll back at once. "There," she murmured. Firm enough to hold, loose enough not to hurt the fabric. Rose touched the knot, then looked toward the east passage. Grace followed her gaze. The music room door remained closed, but that morning it did not seem as distant. Edward saw the same look and felt old dread rise in him, swift and cold. Hope had walked one step forward. Memory stood waiting with a blade of sorrow. At breakfast, Rose sat at the nursery table while Grace arranged toast, jam, and a small cup of warm milk. Mrs. Vale stood near the door, pretending not to watch. Rose reached for the spoon herself. Another small thing. Another impossible thing. By noon, the report had moved through the household without anyone admitting to spreading it. Lady Rose had nodded. Lady Rose had eaten. Lady Rose had stood near Miss Miller without shrinking away. In the servants' hall, even the scullery maid lowered her voice when Grace entered, as if she had brought back some sacred object instead of a child's blue ribbon. Grace disliked the attention. Healing, she knew, did not grow well under too many staring eyes. After luncheon, she carried folded blankets to the nursery and found Edward waiting in the corridor. He looked less severe in daylight, though not less burdened. "Miss Miller," he said. "Your Grace." His gaze moved to the music room door. "Lady Rose has been looking toward the east wing." "Yes. You believe she should be allowed near it." "I believe she already lives near it, whether the door is open or not." The answer was gentle, but it did not yield. Edward looked at her for a long moment. No one in Thornfield spoke to him that way, not insolently, not fearlessly, but as if truth did not require permission from rank. "That room belonged to her mother," he said. "And to her, perhaps," Grace replied. "Memory can be a cruel room when no one is allowed to enter it kindly." His face tightened. "You think I have been unkind. I think you have been grieving." That silenced him more completely. Grace lowered the blankets into the nursery chair. "There is a difference, Your Grace, but children often cannot see it from below." Edward turned away slightly, and for a moment she saw not the Duke, not the Master of Thornfield, but a father who had built walls with trembling hands and called them protection because he could not bear the name fear. "If the room is opened," he said, "and it wounds her, then you sit beside her. And if she still does not speak?" Grace looked toward the nursery, where Rose hummed soundlessly to her doll, mouth moving around a song that had not yet become sound. "Then you keep sitting." The simplicity of it seemed to defeat him. That evening, as dusk gathered blue along the windows, Edward went alone to the locked music room. He stood before the door with the key in his hand for nearly 10 minutes. The household moved quietly behind him, giving the corridor a respectful distance. At last, he turned the key. The lock gave with a soft, reluctant click. Dust, lavender, and old wood breathed out into the hall. Grace stood several steps away with Rose beside her. The child held the doll tightly, eyes wide, body very still. Edward opened the door only a foot, not enough to force the past upon her, enough to show that it was no longer forbidden. Inside, the covered piano waited near the tall windows, its white cloth glowing faintly in the dusk. Rose took one step forward, then stopped. Grace did not touch her. Edward lowered himself slowly to one knee, making himself smaller than the doorway, smaller than his grief, smaller than the fear that had ruled the house. "We do not have to go in," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Not today." Rose looked at him. Her lips parted. A sound came, faint as breath against glass. Not a word. But this time, it was not trapped. Edward heard it. Grace heard it. Even Mrs. Vale, standing in the shadowed distance, lifted a hand to her mouth. Rose placed the doll just inside the threshold, then stepped back to Grace's side. Edward closed his eyes for one brief second. The music room had not restored his child. Not yet, but it had stopped being a tomb. And in Thornfield Hall, that was enough to make the silence tremble. By the third dawn after Grace Miller entered Thornfield Hall, the house had begun to betray its own mourning. A curtain remained open in the nursery after breakfast. A fire was lit in the music room, not high enough to fill it with warmth, but enough to prove the room could breathe again. The porcelain doll rested just inside the threshold where Lady Rose had placed it, her mended sleeve bright with blue ribbon against the faded floorboards. No one moved it. Even Mrs. Vale, who believed order was the last defense against sorrow, walked around the small figure as if it marked holy ground. Rose stood in the corridor with Grace beside her, looking into the room but not entering. Duke Edward waited near the window at the far end, close enough to be present, far enough not to command the moment. The piano remained covered in white cloth. Sunlight touched its shape and made it look less like a ghost than a sleeping thing. Grace held a folded blanket over one arm, though she had no real need of it. Practical objects gave frightened hearts something ordinary to lean upon. "It is a fine morning for dust to be disturbed," she said gently. Rose looked up at her. The child did not smile, but her eyes shifted toward the piano. Grace understood the question that had not yet become words. She stepped into the music room first, slowly, crossing the floor as though every board deserved time to remember footsteps. She set the blanket on a chair and drew one curtain wider. Pale gold light slipped across the floor, over the old rug, over a music stand, over the covered keys. Edward's hand tightened around the window ledge outside the room. For 3 years, he had imagined this moment as unbearable. He had expected collapse, accusation, the sharp return of every hour he had failed his daughter. Instead, he saw a maid opening a curtain and a child watching without fleeing. Sometimes Grace entered not as thunder, but as housekeeping. Rose took one step across the threshold. Grace did not turn too quickly. Edward did not speak. The child bent, picked up her doll, and carried it to the piano bench. She placed it there with solemn care. Then she looked at the covered instrument. Grace approached the piano and paused with her hand above the cloth. "May I?" Rose's fingers tightened on the doll. After a long moment, she nodded. The cloth came away in a soft drift of dust. Beneath it, the piano waited dark and polished, its keys faintly yellowed with time. Grace sat on the edge of the bench, leaving room beside her. She did not play at once. She only rested one finger on middle C and pressed lightly. A single note sounded through the room. It was imperfect, slightly out of tune, but alive. Rose inhaled. Edward closed his eyes. That one note traveled farther than music should. It passed through the open door, down the corridor, into the places of Thornfield where servants stopped mid-task and listened without knowing why. Grace pressed another note, then another, building the smallest shape of the lullaby the wind had given her beneath the door. Rose stood very still, but her lips moved with the rhythm. Grace kept her gaze on the keys, giving the child privacy even in wonder. "Your mother must have loved mourning songs," she said softly. Edward's eyes opened. He should have corrected her. He should have said the Duchess loved Schubert, hymns, and old ballads from her childhood. Instead, the words that came were simpler and more broken. She sang when she was happy. Rose turned toward him. The movement pierced him more deeply than accusation could have. He entered the room then, stopping just inside the door, the way Rose had done the night before. Father and daughter stood on opposite sides of the same threshold, though now the threshold was not wood or lock. It was fear. Grace rose from the bench. "Perhaps His Grace remembers the rest better than I do." Edward looked at her, startled. "I have not played in years." "Then you need not play well." The faintest challenge rested beneath her courtesy. Rose watched him. That decided him. Edward crossed to the piano and sat where Grace had been, leaving space beside him as she had done. His hands hovered over the keys, stiff with memory. Then he played, slowly, unevenly. The lullaby returned in fragments, wounded but recognizable. Rose took one step closer, then another. Her doll slipped from her arms onto the rug, forgotten for the first time. The final note faded. The room held still. Rose looked at her father, and her lips formed a shape he had seen in dreams and dreaded upon waking. A sound trembled, failed, came again. "Pa." Edward did not move. He barely breathed. Grace stood near the curtain, one hand pressed lightly to the fabric, her own eyes bright but silent. Rose's small face tightened with effort, not distress, but courage. "Papa." The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It entered Thornfield Hall like dawn entering a locked room, touching everything that had waited in darkness. Edward lowered himself from the bench to the floor until he was level with his child. He did not reach too quickly. He did not weep loudly. He only opened his hands and answered in a voice rough with 3 years of unsaid love. "I am here." Rose looked at those hands, then stepped into them, and Thornfield Hall, which had listened to clocks for so long, heard a father breathe as if he had been forgiven before he knew how to ask. After Rose spoke, no one in Thornfield Hall knew how to behave. Mrs. Vale stood in the corridor with one hand pressed to her mouth, the keys at her waist finally still. A footman carrying coal stopped so abruptly that dust rose around his boots. Somewhere below, a kitchen maid began to cry without understanding whether she had permission. Grace remained near the music room window, quiet as the curtain beside her, while Duke Edward held his daughter in the center of the room that grief had once forbidden. Rose did not say another word. She did not need to. Her small hands rested against her father's coat, and Edward knelt as if the marble floor were sacred ground, his face bent toward the pale curls that had haunted him for years. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Grace. There was gratitude there, but also fear, because gratitude can be spoken, while the thing he felt had no safe name. Grace lowered her gaze first. She had not come to Thornfield to be seen by a duke. She had come because wages were needed, because work was honorable, because grand houses often had more sorrow than they admitted and more laundry than anyone could fold alone. Yet the way Edward looked at her made the room feel warmer and more dangerous than the fire. Rose pulled back slightly and pointed at the piano. Edward swallowed. Again, Rose nodded. It was small, but now the house knew how to hear her. Edward returned to the bench, and this time Rose sat beside him. He played the lullaby slowly, missing one note, and correcting it with a breath that almost became laughter. Grace moved toward the door, intending to leave father and child with the miracle they had been denied too long. Before she reached the threshold, Rose turned and held out one hand. Not to stop the music, to stop Grace from going. The gesture was so simple that it entered Edward more deeply than the word had. Grace paused. "I am here, Lady Rose," she said softly. Rose seemed satisfied and leaned against her father's sleeve while the song continued. From that morning onward, Thornfield changed in careful measures. Not all at once. Grief does not surrender a house because one word is spoken, but breakfast trays returned less full. The nursery door remained open. The music room was dusted without ceremony. Rose began with single words, placed gently into the day like fragile cups. Milk, doll, window, again. Each one was received not with gasps, but with calm, because Grace insisted that wonder must not become a performance. Edward learned to listen without reaching too quickly. He learned to ask questions that did not demand answers. He learned to sit on the garden bench while Rose arranged pebbles at his feet and spoke only when she wished. The first time she called him Papa outside the music room, in the eastern garden at dawn, Edward closed his eyes and let the word pass through him without trying to keep it prisoner. 1 week later, Mrs. Vale found Grace in the linen room folding sheets and informed her that His Grace wished to speak with her after supper. The housekeeper's voice carried less frost than before, though her pride would not allow warmth to show plainly. "You have done well," Mrs. Vale said. Grace looked up in surprise. "Lady Rose has done well." Mrs. Vale studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. "That is why you have done well." After supper, Grace entered the study where rain had once tapped against dark glass, but tonight the windows stood open to mild spring air. Edward was not behind his desk. He stood near the mantel beneath the uncovered portrait of his late wife, whose painted face watched the room with calm brightness. "I owe you more than thanks," he said. Grace folded her hands. "You owe me only the wages agreed upon, Your Grace." A faint smile touched him, then faded into something more solemn. "I owe you an apology as well. I mistook your gentleness for intrusion because I had mistaken my grief for protection." Grace did not answer quickly. Outside, a night bird called from the garden. Somewhere upstairs, Rose's voice rose in a small, uneven song, guided by a nurse who had once forgotten how joyful sound could be. Grace listened, and Edward listened with her. "You protected what you could bear to face," she said at last. "Now you are learning to protect what she needs." Edward looked at her then, not as master to maid, not as duke to servant, but as a man standing before the person who had witnessed his failure without using it to shame him. "And what do you need, Miss Miller?" The question startled her more than any praise. For years, need had been something she folded away like worn linen, private and practical. She looked toward the open window, where dawn would come again in a few hours. Silver over the garden Rose had begun to enter with her voice. "A place where kindness is not temporary," she said softly. Edward's expression changed, not with a promise too large for the moment, but with the reverence of a man hearing the first note of another locked room opening. Spring came to Thornfield Hall, as if it had been waiting for a child to invite it inside. The frost withdrew from the eastern garden, the lavender beds showed small green tips, and the white roses planted by the late Duchess began to loosen their first pale leaves beneath the mild sun. Windows that had remained shut through seasons of mourning were opened one by one. Dust covers disappeared from chairs. The music room no longer smelled of sealed memory, but of polished wood, fresh air, and the faint sweetness of flowers placed near the piano by Rose herself. She did not become a talkative child overnight. No one expected that of her. Some mornings she spoke only 3 words. Some afternoons she returned to silence, holding her porcelain doll and watching light move across the floor. But silence was no longer a locked room. It had become a choice, and that made all the difference. Duke Edward learned this slowly. He learned not to ask, "Are you happy?" as if happiness could be summoned like a servant. He learned instead to say, "I will be in the garden," and wait. More often than not, Rose followed. Sometimes Grace followed too, carrying a basket of mending she rarely finished because Rose would place flowers into it, one by one, naming those she remembered and inventing names for those she did not. One dawn, nearly a month after the music room opened, Edward found them beneath the old lilac arbor. Rose knelt in the grass arranging pebbles in a circle around her doll, while Grace sat on the bench nearby, her gray work dress touched with lavender petals, her hands folded in her lap as she watched without directing. The rising sun lit her face softly, revealing neither beauty arranged for admiration nor humility performed for approval, but something steadier. A woman who had stayed. Rose looked up when Edward approached. "Papa," she said, clearer than before. The word still humbled him every time. "Yes, my darling." She pointed to the empty place beside Grace on the bench. "Sit." Grace lowered her eyes, but Edward saw the warmth she tried to hide. He obeyed his daughter with the gravity of a royal command and sat, leaving a respectful distance between himself and the maid who had taught his house how to breathe again. Rose returned to her pebbles, satisfied. For a while, no one spoke. Birds moved in the hedges. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a stable hand laughed, and the sound did not feel out of place. Edward looked toward the house, its windows bright with mourning, and thought of all the years he had mistaken stillness for loyalty to the dead. "I have written to the school in the village," he said at last. Grace turned slightly. "For Lady Rose?" "For Rose, eventually, but also for the children of the estate. You once said kindness should not be temporary. I have been thinking about what permanent kindness might require." Grace's hands tightened in her lap. "That is a generous thought, Your Grace." "It was not mine first." She looked away toward Rose. "Goodness does not need ownership." "No," he said, "but gratitude needs honesty." He drew a breath. "Stay at Thornfield, Miss Miller. Not as a maid in the nursery wing, unless that is all you wish. I would have you oversee the new schoolroom, the children's reading, the music hours, whatever shape your care believes useful. You would have proper wages, proper authority, and a place here that no one may call temporary." Grace was still for so long that he feared he had offered too much in the wrong way. Then she looked at him, and he saw that her hesitation was not refusal. It was the disbelief of someone who had learned not to trust open doors. "And if people speak?" she asked. "They already speak. Let them learn to say something worthy." The answer brought the faintest smile to her lips. Rose looked up from her circle of stones. "Grace stays." The question trembled in the morning like the first note of a song. Edward did not answer for her. Grace understood that, and perhaps loved him a little for it before she was ready to name such a thing. She knelt beside Rose and touched the blue ribbon on the doll's sleeve. "If you wish it, and if His Grace truly has work for me." Rose placed one small hand over hers. "I wish it." Grace closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the fear had not vanished, but it had loosened its hold. "Then I will stay." Thornfield Hall did not ring bells. It did not burst into celebration. Its miracle was quieter. A child smiled. A father breathed. A woman who had known too many temporary rooms was given a place by the morning light. In time, society would wonder at the poor maid who remained in a duke's house with honor, authority, and a child's devotion. They would not understand, because society loves titles more than tenderness. But Thornfield understood. The house had been restored not by wealth, command, or grand declarations, but by a woman who sat beside grief until it remembered how to speak. Some hearts are not awakened by being told to heal. They awaken when someone gentle stays long enough for silence to feel safe.